what's up everybody? Quiet Snake here, and I thought I'd go ahead and make a little video, kind of an analysis and a bit of a retrospective, I guess, of Assassin's Creed. I'm getting ready to play Origins for the first time shortly, and I know people are probably like, well, Origins has been out for a while, you got Odyssey now, but I've been taking my time, and rather long time, to get caught up on Assassin's Creed. I've never been behind this much before. So, I thought I'd put on Syndicate just to kind of, it's less chaotic. I've recently been playing Unity. Kind of went back on it a little bit to kind of brush up, maybe get better on some stuff that I was not as well off as I had hoped, and actually made me go back and appreciate some things, notice some things that I just kind of dismissed on my first time. It had been a couple of years since I had finished playing Unity, and it made me kind of go back and look at the whole series. And so, judging from the series, as far as Syndicate up to this point, the games have gotten a lot better. Although in terms of certain aspects, obviously with their yearly releases, the quality of certain parts of the game did not get as much shine. Obviously, that's been very well documented, as the case with Unity, as you know, it was pretty much sent out with a lot of bugs. Even after the patch was done, there was still a lot of issues that didn't get fixed. I did not have as many issues with the game as obviously when it came out on launch. Obviously the patch did fix the bulk of it. I still had a few issues here and there, but it was minimal. But looking back at the series from this point forward, there's a lot of things that I like. There's some things I don't like, particularly where the story has been concerned in the last several years with the story. I felt that Syndicate's story was not as strong as some of the other ones. Unity has a better story in general, although there are a lot of holes in there that I felt that they could have worked on. They could have taken more time and advanced certain plot points that I felt needed to be addressed. For example, Arno was still beating himself up and blamed himself over the death of his father, even though he was a child when his father was killed by Shay Cormac from Assassin's Creed Rogue. That did not get resolved in my mind, and I felt to some degree it should have been. He was more broken up about his surrogate adopted father, Grandmaster de la Serre, who was obviously of the Templars. And he blamed himself for his death because he could not avert it or warn him in time. And him obviously joining the Assassins later on was his way of atoning for that, even though you know, obviously Assassins and Templars have been at war since, you know, largely since time began, I guess, in a way, or at least from what Origins is going to point out. From the little bit that I do know of it, is that it's going to start out much differently, obviously. So, you know, he was more concerned about avenging his death than his father's, and while I can understand to a point that Grandmaster de la Serre did take him in, and he was obviously the father of Elise, his love interest, you know, that gave him a little bit, in his mind, a little bit more to hold on to, versus he was still very young when his father was killed. But nonetheless, I felt that they could have, or at least if nothing else, put DLC to where possibly he could have hunted down Shay, or at least found out, you know, where he was, and had some closure to that story part that I felt that should have been done. And I think that's largely where the story of Unity falls short for me, in that there was there wasn't enough closure for certain parts. Obviously, we knew Elise was going to be killed. Um, I could have seen that coming. Obviously, them being of two different factions, obviously that was not going to go over well, regardless of how much they wanted to be with each other. Their obligations to each their respective orders was going to be an issue. Even though I felt that somewhere in the story they've probably felt that they could probably find a way to bridge the gap between the two orders, which has been hinted at in previous games. I believe AC3 also kind of elaborated on the idea that at some point they had tried to make amends, but it never lasted long, which is where in Unity they pick up that there was a tense peace treaty between the two organizations, which when Delacera was killed, that obviously kind of threw that all out of the woodwork. And so, and moving on from Unity, and on a side note from Unity as well, one thing that I felt that they should have explained more, but I guess that's more, you know, as a side thing if you want to read about the lore, you know, in the wikis and whatnot, was the Sword of Eden, which at the beginning of the game we get a nice glimpse of, and you kind of get a taste of its power, and then obviously at the end of the game you get it, but it's not at its full strength. To me, it just kind of felt placed there. You know, most of the previous games, an artifact of the precursors has had more of. It's been more focused in the story, and this time I felt that it just was placed there just so you can have an OP weapon to have at the end of the game, whereas it was something that the Templars and the Assassins were fighting over for control, which is what they've been doing for a lot of the other games. And I don't know, maybe they felt that they needed to change the story up in that regard so that it wasn't the main focal point. It was more of a personal story, which from a story writer's perspective, I can kind of understand to a point, but at the same time, I felt that it hinged too much on that. It felt like they were doing too much trying to recreate what they did in the Ezio trilogy. And obviously the Ezio trilogy is a very special place in my heart as far as Assassin's Creed goes. Obviously 2 for me is the best one in my opinion in terms of story. Obviously, you know, it does hinge a lot on revenge and you know, discovering, you know, your identity and your place within everything. Excuse me while you get out of my way. And Brotherhood was a great story. You know, and it was nice that they put Cesare in place of Rodrigo, whereas, you know, a lot of people probably expected that Rodrigo was just going to kind of be, you know, I want revenge for the humiliation that you inflicted on me at the end of 2. No, they instead put in Cesare, which I felt was a much more fitting adversary for Ezio in his older years. Revelations, obviously, it was a shorter game, but I didn't mind that because when you look at in terms of character, Ezio was in his 50s. So obviously, if you think about it, later on in your years, you're going to be wanting to do things like settle down to a point. You know, you're not, especially for somebody who wasn't born into the order, you're not going to spend your entire life, much like Altair did, who devoted his entire life to the order. You're not going to want to spend your entire life killing people. And I believe the animated short Embers told that pretty well, that Ezio was tired. He didn't want to do it anymore. And obviously at the end of Revelations, he had said, I had seen enough for one lifetime. You know, it's time for me to move past this part. I've played my part. I've done what I was supposed to do, what I was called to do. And and he went out in the I believe, the way he wanted to. Obviously, not wanting to die from a heart attack or natural causes, but he died with his family instead of dying at the end of somebody's blade that he didn't know for a cause that he was still struggling to understand why they were fighting for so many years, which is what prompted the entire story of Revelations to begin with. And so that called it into his story. Assassin's Creed 3, I enjoyed, but it was a very bitter, not bitter's a strong word to use. It wasn't as enjoyable for me personally because of the setting of the American Revolution. Obviously, growing up in the States, that's what we hear about constantly, and it just wasn't as interesting to me, even though you didn't take place in every battle. You were kind of doing your own thing within the confines of whatever battle was going on at that time, whether it was aiding, the assassination of a Templar general on the Redcoat side, or even on the colonial side. I did think it was a very nice switch that they threw at us at the beginning of the game, where they introduced Haytham Kenway, who we thought was an assassin, but turned out to be a Master Templar. And when you read the novels, it's actually really interesting that they bring up that he was raised as an assassin, but trained by Templars. And I wish that the games had done some justice to that point of showing memories of when Haytham was young and he was abducted by, or not abducted, rather he was taken in by Reginald Birch, who was the Grand Master of the Colonial Order. British Order, excuse me. I'm getting my brain scrambled here. And trained him, and his sister was sold into slavery. And later on in years, he was able to track down and find his sister, who I believe, if I'm not mistaken, was his last living relative. And then learned that it was the Grand Master of the Templars, Reginald Birch, who had killed his father, Edward Kenway. And then they sought him out and killed him, and pretty much by then, Haytham Kenway had pretty much removed himself for the most part from Templar activity, which is something that they don't nearly show as much in the game, although you can kind of get a hint at it that he's tired of it. The books mention that he had, I believe, moved out to the country and full of everything, and moved out to the country, and I believe had started like a vineyard or something like that. I forget. Something along the lines of what Ezio had started to do in his old age. Black Flag was an incredible game, and it's probably my second favorite out of all of them. The exploration, the naval combat, while the story in some spots is not traditional Assassin's Creed story, in that he doesn't start to become an assassin. Oh, thank you for the 5,000 pounds. Very generous. He doesn't start out as an assassin. He's, a privateer who kind of gets waylaid on a job and then kind of falls in with the Templars unintentionally, while he's just really looking to get paid and make money. And then kind of gets caught up in between them. And then later on, his ambitions get the best of him. He starts losing out on his friends. People abandon him, because he becomes obsessed with, finding the big heist. To basically set up him and his wife so that they can live a comfortable life, which, to a point, I don't rock that, because, he wanted better. The cutscene that starts out at the beginning of the game, they're basically living in a shack, and any decent person would want better than that. So obviously, his intentions were starting out, good. He wanted to go on a job, make money, and build a real life, and not just shambles, for him and his wife. And of course later on in the years, after he starts to atone for his mistakes early in his life, the assassins start to take him in. finds out that he has a young daughter, which he raises her and gives the assassins his hideout to use as they see fit for their activities, and then goes on to later have a family and, you know, lives out the rest of his days until obviously the events that lead up to AC3 start to take fruition. Obviously, I've gone over most of Unity's plot. The main issue that I had with Unity wasn't as much story. They were very ambitious with what they did with the game. You know, going back through and playing it again, I realized that it still is a good, solid game. You know, it has its issues, obviously, with everything that's built into it. The parkour system, even though it was kind of cleaned up in Syndicate, the parkour system was better than it had been in previous games. Although traversing in the wilderness in 3 was also very satisfying as well. There were some things. I love the customization options of Unity. Obviously, Syndicate just trimmed it down to basics, where, you know, for example, obviously you have your coats, which each one has a little something attached to it, whereas it's all under one system instead of having individual pieces, which is good and it's bad, but I guess it depends on everybody's personal playstyle. Jacob and Evie themselves have very opposing personalities, which is a nice mix. Obviously, Jacob is the more headstrong, want to be out in the open, very clash against traditional Creed standards, you know, whereas Evie is more of a traditional assassin, where she prefers stealth and hiding in plain sight, not making an audacious mess, much like Jacob does throughout the game, and Evie has to go back and clean it up. And I felt that Arno was a very conflicted character. I felt that he wasn't nearly as strong mentally as Ezio. Ezio, while he had his issues, Arno was... Hey, thank you. About to say, my loot. Thanks. Arno was... He was a little bit more emotionally... I'm not going to say unstable, but he wasn't tethered, I think, as much as Ezio started to be. Obviously, at first, you know, revenge was his primary motivation for what he was doing, wanting to get back at Rodrigo for killing his father and brothers. And in years later, wanting revenge against Cesare for destroying Monteriggioni, killing his uncle Mario, taking the apple, basically enslaving his friend Leonardo da Vinci. And so, you know, Arno doesn't have I guess you can't really weigh it in terms of, you know, what one person has lost versus another character, but I didn't think Arno, at the end of the day, really had nearly as much to me in terms of emotional attachment that I think if they had executed his character in maybe a slightly different way, he might have come off a little bit better than just a French Ezio Auditore. But in terms of Unity's overall scope, getting back to that point, I know I trailed off a little bit there. They were very ambitious with a lot of things. They wanted to showcase, much like Assassin's Creed 3 did, they wanted to showcase how many bodies they could put on the screen at one time. Which is kind of what they did a little bit to a point in 1, where they crowded the streets with NPCs. But whereas in later games, everybody has kind of a path, and they have their everyday activities that they go out and do, 1 was basically just to put everybody in your way, which made it annoying to navigate. in certain parts, because you brush up against anything in one, and you're already guaranteed to stir up somebody and pretty much start a fight, and either have to do the fight or flight options. Um, Unity put a lot of characters on screen, and obviously during the French Revolution, there was a lot of revolt, a lot of upheavals that obviously would warrant a lot of crowds and riots and protests. Uh, but I think in certain parts it was just too much, and I think that's probably part of what um, where it hurt the game in terms of systems wise. There was too much going on in one spot, and and they had to come back to it and patch it. Like, okay, we obviously we messed up here. We did a lot, and it's actually hurting the game because it's putting too much stress on all the other systems that they can't coexist and mesh well. And some of the missions feel incredibly unbalanced. Some of them are actually quite fun. Some of the single player challenges, though, I wish they had given a little bit more detail. Excuse me. The single player challenges in each mission, it'll give you, kill brutes from cover, or, headshots, but it doesn't give you any details or clarification as to how much you have to do, and it ends up leading to multiple playthroughs where you have to, okay, how many times do I need to kill somebody from cover, or how many enemies do I need to berserk, or how many snipers do I have to kill? In terms of weaponry, much like all the other previous games, Unity had a large degree of weapons, although I don't feel that as they are as spaced out, and a lot of them feel like they have the same stats. There's a large bit of variety in this one, as not in this one, I'm sorry, in Legacy, in Unity. So there's quite a bit to choose from. Some of them do really well. Some don't. For instance, I don't particularly care for blunt weapons in games, so therefore I'm typically a sword guy, which is why I have the Kukri blade. I can't never get this word right. Kukri blades for Jacob. Obviously, they turned down a lot on the weapons and a lot of the tools of the series in Syndicate. They simplified a lot of things instead of compounding on top of systems that were already in place. You have the brass knuckles, which is obviously it's kind of a staple of the time period. You have the blade, and then you have the cane sword, which I have attached to Evie because I feel the cane sword fits her fighting style very, very well, and it's very brutal, and I really enjoy it. In terms of the story of Syndicate, it's kind of a mixed bag, to be honest, in terms of the story for me, because a lot of it is, to me, Jacob starts a mess, and then Evie has to go clean it up. And then it's basically just a giant sibling rivalry, which, in a way, I guess, mirrors the state of the mind of the Order at this point. And it was something that was brought to my attention in a YouTube video from somebody. I can't remember who it was, but it basically kind of illustrates the mindset of the Order, where the person who basically had pointed it out, that the American colonies' orders had become a little bit more fanatical. They were a little more extreme. They didn't adhere to the tenets of the Creed as previous games did as much. Obviously, Edward didn't, really go for that. The mechanics were tied into his character, but obviously his character core didn't rely on, okay, I need to hide in plain sight. I need to not kill innocent people. And obviously when it comes to don't compromise the Brotherhood, he had little to no regard for that until much later on when he realized how much he screwed up. So I believe that that kind of mindset influenced how Jacob and Evie interact with each other. Evie's much more traditional, whereas Jacob just wants to be more out in the open, and it creates a very strong dynamic and a very distinct separation between the two characters. In terms of gameplay, they don't play that much differently, although Evie has some special perks to her that I really enjoy, where, as an example, whenever she crouches, she can turn stealth and invisible for, as long as she doesn't move. Whereas Jacob doesn't really have that much, although he can be stealthy when he needs to be. And speaking of stealth, I feel that, and I hope that the later games, I don't know about Odyssey. I haven't really watched much of it. I'm leaving as much of the next two games blind as possible. In terms of stealth, I feel that the stealth mechanics of the games have waned a lot in the last several years. It was only up until Unity that we actually got a crouch option, although you had to hold it. Whereas in other stealth games, you have a toggle option, much like the Metal Gear Solid series when they later added it, where all you have to do is just press X, much like Jacob is doing now, and he enters stealth mode, or low profile mode as they prefer to call it. I feel that they could have done this a long time ago, when the game is centered around stealth and being one with the crowd, that particular system should have been implemented much sooner, instead of just standing in a crowd of 4 or 5 people and then your character goes gray and it shows that you're blended. Whereas, that system is fine, but I felt that they should have added that a long time ago, instead of, now we're in the PS4 era, when we could have had something much sooner where we could go through, and especially it's a bit of an annoyance having to hold down the left trigger to go into stealth mode, whereas you can just press one single button and enter it and be able to crouch and hide as you need to. The cover system is not so bad. Like I said, it doesn't stick nearly as much, which is good. They really fixed a lot of the things that Unity messed up on, which I'm glad that they did. Excuse me, guys, coming through. Jacob, get down. There you go. And so I think going forward, and like I said, I hope that they do more of that in later games. Stealth as a mechanic needs to be a more integral part of the series. It needs to be more balanced. It doesn't always need to be the way it has been. And speaking of that, as far as advancements, I know a lot of people have been, some people have been annoyed by the fact that RPG elements have been added to the series. I don't particularly mind it as long as it's light RPG. The last thing that we need is to have Assassin's Creed basically become a third-person Elder Scrolls game. Obviously, with the skill trees, I have no issue with that. I think that creates a nice dynamic that everybody can tailor their experience to a specific tree in their own playstyle, and have abilities and perks and skills that reflects how they like to play the game. And so I feel that that is something that I honestly I don't have an issue with, as long as it's not like a complete level up system like, say, a JRPG or Dark Souls or any of those other franchises that are more RPG based. And so, excuse me. Sir? Sir? Yeah, he's dead. At worst, knocked out. But he's probably dead. Yeah, he's dead. So, I'm very excited to see where the series is going. In Origins, Egypt is one of my favorite time periods. I was very interested in it as a kid. I know, nerd. But, you know, I've heard nothing but great things about Origins, and it was time for Ubisoft to get off of their yearly release schedule that they were doing. And I predicted that before too long, it was going to start to really have a negative impact on the series, and it did start to have a negative impact. The games have, to a degree, in one aspect or another, show neglect. Obviously, one of the biggest issues that I've felt that has gotten neglect is the modern day story, and I felt that when they killed Desmond in 3, that hurt them story-wise, because you don't have an anchor to propel your modern-day story forward, which is what they've been pushing towards for years now. And they've said that, you know, their modern day would get more attention, and bit by bit, it has gotten a little bit more attention, but not nearly enough where they can start to flesh out the story. And obviously, when they killed Desmond, who was their lead to kind of spearhead the war in the modern day, now that they've written him out of the story, it kind of leaves a lot to be for a lot of people to wonder, you know, well, how do they... Excuse me, miss. Sorry, it leaves a lot for people to wonder, you know, what do they do with the main story? Obviously, the modern day story is not as integral as what's going on in the past when they go through the Animus. Obviously, if the modern day story was going to be the focal point, they pretty much would have made a whole game by now featuring that, which I'm hoping that they do at some point, because I believe that the modern day is going to have to take center stage at some point, because you've got the whole story arc with Juno. You've got other small minor branches that are supposed to link up with that, and that is it was hinted at in Liberation story, which I feel was a really good game that they really could have done more when they remastered it. They could have added more story to it instead of just... I mean, in terms of gameplay, they obviously updated a lot from the Vita's control system, but I felt that they could have added more in terms of story. You know, where they were specifically talking about, you know, how they needed to find Eve's descendant, you know, to help spearhead the war as well. Obviously, we know Desmond was part of Adam's lineage, but then Eve's side of the story has pretty much, or Eve's descendant story hasn't really been, at least as far as right now, hasn't been touched on. Obviously, I think the later games probably, to a degree, I would imagine have done that. Although I heard that Odyssey does pretty much drop the modern day story, so which I hope they come back to at some point. You know, so that they can actually end the series off right. And I think that, realistically speaking, Assassin's Creed needs to be closing out within the next 1 to 2 games, however many they have planned. I really believe that within 1 to 2 at max, the series needs to close out. As much as I love the series, they run a risk of becoming too stale. Obviously, they've gotten more. They've gone way back to more interesting time periods for me personally. You know, during ancient Egypt and ancient Greece. Excuse me, I was walking right there. whereas you have the Industrial Revolution, which is also an interesting time period because it's ushering in a more modern age where you have less of the old world weapons and more firearms, explosives, technology starting to kind of take more of a priority. You have everything that goes on in this game centered around more modern day things, economies, communication systems and whatnot. And to go back to simpler times, I think will bring that much more interest back because it's a much simpler time, but I think it's a much more complex time as well. So I'm really excited to see where Origins goes in terms of story and how it plays out. So I do not know yet if I will be doing that on Twitch or YouTube. Might be Twitch, so I will figure that out once I get the game. I'll be probably getting the game about next week, and I'll be streaming the entirety of that game, however long it takes. Plus or minus, maybe like some level up or looting, grinding, whatever has to be done instead of doing all that. So, as a whole, I love Assassin's Creed for what it has done. I just hope that the developers have a clear and concise story that they can end it on that gives the series a meaningful send-off. As any passionate gamer, in a series that we love, we want to see a series that we've grown to enjoy and love get a proper send-off. You don't want something obviously to be cheap and have a cheesy ending. You don't want it to be like a sitcom. So hopefully I'm hoping it'll be a very rewarding experience to play Origins. I'm very excited. Going back and playing the last couple of games over again a little bit it's kind of renewed my love for the series. I took a break from it for a time to play some other games, and coming back to one of the cores of my gaming life has really brought a kind of a renewed sense to really get back into what I really enjoyed playing. And so yeah, so I'm gonna go ahead and end this right here. If you liked the video, just like it. Feel free to subscribe if you like. Like I said, I'm gonna try to have more content up on my YouTube in the coming months, and I'll be posting on Twitter what I'll be streaming on for Origins and eventually Unity as well. So that's it for right now as far as my little analysis. I'll probably try and do something more like this again when it comes to Unity and Odyssey, to kind of see where the series has come versus the rest of the series. So I hope you guys enjoyed. Feel free to comment or anything if you like, and I will see you guys next time. This is Quiet Snake, signing off.